Hi, this is David Roscoff again with Test Automation. Today we're going to go over unit testing attributes. To start off, we're going to go ahead and create a new project. We're going to create a unit test project, and I'm going to go ahead and say test attributes, and I'm going to put this in my training folder. So what test attributes are is when you're doing a unit testing, you have to declare what classes are test classes, which methods are test methods, and which methods are initialization methods, and what methods are cleanup methods. Um, so here, it automatically gives me an easy test. Test class, unit test 1, test method 1. So you can see this, I'm just going to go ahead and do a debug dot write line test method 1 action. Okay? And just so it's easier to see, I even put some stars in there. So if I go to run this method, and I say run tests, it's going to go ahead and pass because I didn't assert anything. And if you look at the output window, if you look at the debug window here, you'll see there is a test method action. So it kind of tells you, hey, it ran it, it outputted to my window, I'm good. Now, if I did another test method, and for purposes of this lesson, so that we see the relationships of how things are working, I'm going to rename my test methods to A and B. Dot write line. I'm just actually going to copy this above, paste it below. This one's going to be test method B. This one's going to be test method A. Now, if I run test method B, and I say run tests, I'll only get test method B. I won't get this one because it only runs the test that I selected. So if I go, let me try this again. And you can see here, test method B action. There's no test method A. Now if I ran the whole class, so if I went on a class level and I right clicked and I said debug tests, I should see test method A and then test method B in my debug, or vice versa. And so here you see them both, they've run. Now, so what happens is it'll run these, and perhaps not in any particular order, which could be a problem for some people because when you're creating a test, sometimes you might want it to do something beforehand. So they created something called test initialize. What test initialize does is it will run before every method. So in here, so you can see how this works, if I put this up here, and I say test setup, setting up test. So what's going to happen? It should run, and it's going to run this line first. It's then going to run one of the test methods. It's then going to go back to this line, and it's then going to run the other test method. And so if I debug this test, you'll see setting up test, test method B action, then it goes back, setting up test, and then it goes to the test method A action. Now on top of that, there's another initialization one. There's one called class initialize. What class initialize will do is it'll run once for the entire class. So if I run method A, it's going to come and it's going to run whatever the class initialize is. It's then going to run the test initialize, and then finally run the test method A initialize. The class initialize will only run once for the class, so when it goes to test method B, since the class initialize has already been run for the class once, it won't run again. It will, however, run a test initialize again. To show you that, maybe if I run this, class. The other thing to note is when you're doing a class initialize, the class initialize has to be static, so you'd be public static void. And it also has to take in a test context as an attribute. You don't have to use it, but you do have to be able to have it as a property in your class, so in your method, in your method. So now, if I run this, and I say, let's run the whole test here, so I'm just going to go to top, and I'm going to say debug tests. You're going to see the results here. So there, it ran the sitting class test. So it ran that first method of class setup. It then ran whatever was in test setup method. It then ran the test method B, and then it ran the test setup method again, and then test method A. Now, so how does this work in programming? What will happen is, for instance, I might have my class initialize log me into the program. I might have test initialize set data for me. And I might have each of the tests check for the different parts of that data that should be valid. And so there's a lot of way to organize these tests, but what these initializers are supposed to do is allow you to be able to, instead of having a big long test for each test method, you can split them up more modularly. So you can say, well, I'm going to log in for each of my tests, so I'll go ahead and put that in the class initialize stage. Well, each of my tests, I'm going to need to set this property, so I'm going to go ahead and do that for each of my test initialize stage. Likewise, there's also a class and test cleanup. So, for instance, let's say that after every test, I wanted something to happen in terms of cleaning up the test. Maybe I want to navigate to the main page. I just go to my test cleanup, and I could say, and whatever happens in this will happen after every test. So run test cleanup. So now if I go and run this again, you'll see that my methods will go as the following. So there. So it starts with setting up the class tests, and it sets up the actual test itself. It runs a test, and then it runs whatever's in the test cleanup. If you don't have these attributes, they won't run them. Um, if you do have them, it will run them. And it'll only run it for that method or for that class. So for instance, if I'm in another class, it's not going to run this test cleanup. Another thing to note as well is if you also have the same for class cleanup, which runs once per class. And that one again is a static. And then you also have another one that actually runs that even runs once for the entire framework. And once for the entire framework, I mean you can have multiple test classes in your framework. This method, assembly cleanup or assembly initialize, will only run once for the entire assembly. So what would I do with that? So assembly initialize I might use to actually create my WebDriver. So for instance, my browser instance. I'm only going to need one browser when I'm actually doing all these tests. And so I'll just initialize it. In my assembly initialize, I'll create my browser. And it'll just create that object and it'll set it. And that'll run before anything runs. Now some things to note. So assembly initialize, you can only have once in your entire project. So if you have another test, so if I created another unit test here, unit test 2, unit test 2, if I added assembly initialize to unit test 2, it's going to give me an error because it already exists in unit test 1. So oftentimes for assembly initialize, what I'll end up doing is I'll end up creating a new base class basically. So I'll rename this here to base. And I will stick my assembly initialize in that class. And what will happen is if I rerun this again, you will see that it'll actually hit that assembly initialize on a completely different class file first because it's part of the project, and then it will go and run what I want to run. And the other thing I need to make sure is I have the test context because it's a higher up. All right, so now if I run unit test 1, you will see there's my assembly initialize, there's my class setup, there's my test setup, there's my test cleanup, and then it's setting up the next test, running the test, then cleans up that test, and then finally cleans up that class. And again, if I wanted to, let's say that I wanted to close the browser after I'm done running all of my tests, I could create an assembly cleanup. And I could say cleaning up assembly from base class. And this will run after everything in the entire framework is run and done, this command will run. And again, sometimes I might use that for actually closing a browser. If I'm creating a browser in the WebDriver session here, I'll clear it up here. That way I'm not leaving anything open. That completes my lesson on unit testing and test setup. I hope all these things made sense to you and that you're able to use them in order to increase the efficiency of your testing.